The Focal View of Culture, a Way of Life, ISBN 978-976-9676886 podcast was captured and framed in 9 chapters in publication 247 and verbalized in podcast 135. Revision theory is a subfield of philosophical logic. It consists of a general theory of definitions, including, but not limited to, circular and interdependent concepts. That said, as an author, cinematographer, media art specialist, licensed cultural practitioner, podcaster, and publisher, I deem the aforesaid as the designated locale to introduce and stage the focal view of culture, since its primary function in this conversation is to focus on the social behavior and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. In light of the aforesaid, there seems to be a perception that global citizens acquire knowledge through the learning processes of enculturation and socialization, which is shown by the diversity of cultures across societies. Therefore, clarifying existing thoughts about culture through my lens in this context is perceived as or comports itself like a field of view, which is the open, observable area of global citizens who can see through their eyes or via an optical device. For example, in the case of optical devices and sensors, field of view describes the angle through which the devices can pick up electromagnetic radiation. Equally, focal length tells us how long a lens is. Thus, in this context, the focal length of the lens always is the distance from the lens to the spot, and its power is the inverse of this distance in millimeters. Field of view informs us as to how much of a scene a lens can see. In other words, it's a more informative benchmark regarding what you can photograph with the specific camera and lens you are using. This view is equivalent to cultural cognition, which refers to the tendency of people to fit their perceptions of risk and related facts to their group commitments, a view espoused by Dan Kahn, the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Law at Yale Law School and a CCP researcher. To put it succinctly, people's cultural backgrounds affect their most basic cognitive processes, categorizing learning, casual reasoning, and even attention and perception. Perception in this context refers to lens. Consequently, this way of thinking also encompasses philosophy for the reason that it is embedded in everything, including culture. We all have philosophies which form the basis for our motivations and what we do with our days. Everyone has their own philosophy of life, and every institution has a philosophy. Through Dennis Thomas's software developer lens, philosophy creates culture because philosophy is essential about finding a purpose to do something, and when a purpose is found, it has to resonate with people. When people regard it highly, then it becomes a practice. Practices are then transferred to enough people down to the next generation, where now you have a community of like-minded people performing a particular practice, and such practices are later identified as culture. And when something becomes a culture, there is hardly any room for questions or thoughts. What began with a question cannot be questioned anymore. How ironic! Different minds create different thoughts, which result into different desires and conclusions. Some things which are highly regarded by one community may be disregarded by another community. Some cultures are ruled by science. For instance, this occurs by the gradual, unorchestrated diffusion of ideas from science into the culture, while some are simply ruled by fear. Has relevance because culture of fear or climate of fear is the concept that people may incite fear in the general public to achieve political or workplace goals through emotional bias. It was developed as a sociological framework by Frank Furedi and has been more recently popularized by the American sociologist Barry Glassner. However, for all intents and purposes, all cultures aim towards psychological and physiological well-being, although the effectiveness of a particular culture may be questionable, and well-being is restricted only to people belonging to this community. Another example, any philosophy or expression of beliefs can evolve and grow over time. As teachers strengthen their theoretical knowledge and gain practical experience, their personal teaching philosophy will also change. Further to this point, the size of the camera lens or focal length is the main factor that determines the field of view. This thought comports itself like an intelligence quotient, generally describes a score on a test that rates the subject's cognitive ability as compared to the general population. Therefore, the higher the focal length value, the lower the field of view. A fixed lens is one where the camera's focal length is permanently set and cannot be adjusted by the user. This definition extends to all areas of the physical reality where the outside world we perceive as merely a representation of what is impressed upon the senses. The objects we see are in truth wave-emitting or reflecting objects, which the brain shows to the conscious self in various forms and colors. Whether the colors and forms experienced perfectly match between person to person may never be known. That people can communicate accurately shows that the order and proportionality in which experience is interpreted is generally reliable. Thus, one's reality is at least compatible to another person's in terms of structure, and ratio has to do with angle of view. Human vision, as interpreted by the brain through two eyes, has a combined field of view and about 120 to 140 degrees, sometimes a bit less, but seldom more. This means our eyes see the world much like a wide field panorama camera captures it on film, minus the distortions. Angle of view describes how much of the scene in front of the camera will be captured by the camera's sensor. In slightly more technical terms, it is the angular extent of the scene captured on the sensor, measured diagonally. Again, I emphasize the point that naturally that this important information for practitioners of photography, since field of view is more important. Field of view informs us as to how much of a scene a lens can see. In other words, it's a more informative benchmark regarding what you can photograph with the specific camera and lens you are using. A case in point, culture therefore provides a lens through which to view and interpret the world, and so helps generate our specific experiences. This is important to note. Field of view changes as two factors change: focal length of the lens and the size of the sensor or size of film. your camera uses. The difficulty is that field of view, though it's more informative, changes dependent on the size of the camera's sensor. Plausibly, this example may be likened to traveling since it changes our mindset or values every time. Experiencing other cultures, meeting new people, and exploring unfamiliar places undoubtedly shapes our worldview. As a result, focal length which does not change is what's most commonly used by camera manufacturers. The above-mentioned explicit captured and framed detailed analogies activated the process for me to acquire knowledge and my conscious mental activities to the extent that I was inspired to view culture through another lens. A case in point, culture as the overarching strategy and rationale of this research, I began to focus my theoretical lens on providing a working definition of culture, since it's not easy, as evidenced by the numerous definitions used in various disciplines, a view espoused by Carola Homerich and Suzanne Klein. According to James Clifford, culture remains a deeply compromised idea I cannot yet do without. 1988-10. This remark shows the dilemma inherent in the notion of culture, especially if envisaged conventionally as bounding, unitary, and permanent. The very first attempt at a systematic definition stems from anthropologist Edward Burnett Taylor, who saw culture as a complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Taylor, 1958-1871. At the beginning of the 1950s, Kurbera and Kluckland, 1952, find 164 different definitions of culture, and we assume there to be more rather than less today. Grouping them by similarity, Kurbera and Kluckland, 1952, come up with 6 major classes of definitions of culture. See also Berry et al., 1992, 166. Ribel and Seipel, 2008-15. Definitely, in this writing space environment, I employ a normal lens to capture and frame everything from close-up portraits to landscapes. In actuality, this lens has a wide aperture and tends to be very fast lens, hence making it great for indoor and low-light photography. However, metaphorically, I have employed this lens as a simple way of defining culture. Culture is a system for differentiating between in-group and out-group people. Culture is what keeps people together, so you could even say, as an author, cinematographer, media art specialist, licensed cultural practitioner, podcaster, and publisher, I am conversant with this definition, and this is the main reason why I have selected the same as my focal length, because its function determines 2 characteristics in this conversation that are very important, namely magnification and angle of view. I suppose that since photography has a positive impact in all spheres of the society, it helps to maintain the culture and heritage ideal for educating the new generation. Then, magnification is important in 2 main contexts, buying a lens and figuring out your depth of field, while angle of view is what actually matters in practice. At the end of the day, this conversation, the focal view of culture, a way of life, ISBN 9789769676886, is a theoretical assertion. This discourse imputes the focal view of culture symbolically and philosophically, and is characterized as high magnification and angle of view. In some ways, it may also be perceived as access to academic spheres so you can fill the frame with subjects, even though they are further away from the camera. This conversation was analyzed through my lens as an author, cinematographer, media arts specialist, licensed cultural practitioner, podcaster, and publisher. Importantly, global citizens in this context can be interpreted or comport themselves like a camera, and lens can be interpreted as their eyes. The focal view of culture, a way of life, ISBN 978-976-96768-86 podcast was captured and framed in 9 chapters in publication 247 and verbalized in podcast 135.